Hello again everyone, and welcome to my newest video. We're going to be painting a watercolor donut today, and I really like this one. It was a lot of fun to paint, and I think it turned out really well, so hopefully you don't have too much trouble following along if that's what you like to do, or hopefully you just enjoy watching if that's your preference. Anyway, I'm mixing up a really warm chocolatey brown color here to start out with my donut, because it's a chocolate donut. Here I'll have a reference photo up in the corner. But I mixed this really rich chocolatey color by starting with a warm base of quinacridone gold, and I added in some yellow and some blue and some warm violet that I had already mixed up. And I ended up with this gorgeous chocolatey brown that I'm putting down here right now. You can't see very well, but there is a very light pencil sketch. I'm not just throwing this color down. There's a very light pencil sketch that I've got going down here. But it's hard to pick up on camera. It's hard to see. I always try and do very light sketches for watercolors, especially for something that I really want to pop like this. I don't want the pencil getting in the way. And right now I'm just filling up everywhere that I see this chocolate icing on my donut here, just in a really light wash. And you want to start out with a really light wash like that, because some of those really light spots are going to end up being the highlight that makes your frosting look nice and shiny on that donut. You see where I took my paper towel there and removed some of the color where my little highlight was getting lost? You gotta make sure to preserve your white highlights, or else it's not gonna look like a shiny frosted donut. It's gonna look like a dull, not shiny donut. There are powdered donuts, and those are perfectly fine, but this is a shiny donut. We're going for a shiny look here. And as you can see, after I put that very light wash in initially, I'm just carefully dabbing in some darker colors around the edges of the donut where it curves away from your point of view, because those spots are going to be darker. They're not going to pick up as much light. The highest point on that donut is going to be the lightest part, because it's reflecting the most light. And this is another place where you got to pay attention to the highlight. You see there's a little highlight in a half circle around the bottom of that donut where the edge of the frosting is, and where it starts to drip over the side of the donut. And you want to be very careful to maintain that highlight, because if you put too much paint over that, no matter how much you lift it away again, it'll never be the bright white highlight you want it to be. So you have to keep that space clear of paint. I'm already putting in some of that caramel color. Again, I'm starting very lightly with my wash. I'm filling in this little caramel drizzle that I had over my donut. I think this, I'll have to put the colors down in my materials card, because I can't quite remember what colors I mixed for this caramel color, but it wasn't too complicated. I think it was just a mix of the chocolate color I had previously mixed and what is that color that I can't think of right now? I'll pop it up later. I'm sure I can look it up. But anyway, now I'm adding in some of these shadows, and this is a really fun spot because this is when it starts looking even more three-dimensional, when you start adding in some of those darker contrasting shadows. I'm adding my shadows underneath the lip of that frosting where it dips into the donut, and also in that center hole where the donut itself blocks the light from hitting. It's a plate, I suppose, that it's going to be eventually sitting on, but it's not sitting on anything at the moment. I'm just very slowly dotting in these darker layers of contrast. I'm building up my darker spots. Once you've got those first couple of washes down, that's when you've got to start paying attention to where your subject matter is the darkest and start slowly building up those layers. Now see, for the cake part of the donut, I had never actually painted a cake texture like this before, so it was really interesting to try and experiment with, and I ended up just using just little speckles, just little spots that I carefully layered up to create a sort of cakey appearance. And here's another spot where you've got to watch that reflection. Right where there's a bite taken out of my donut, you notice there's a bright white line right there. I'm going to maintain part of that bright white line, and it's going to look like the reflection of the light where the frosting breaks and turns into the cake. It's going to be really cool. It's going to add to that three-dimensional effect. Now it looks like I'm just putting in some more cake speckles. When you're doing something like that cake, or really anything with watercolor, the trick to making it look more three-dimensional is to not completely cover up the lighter layers that you put down before. You want to end up at the finish of your piece having multiple layers of varying tones of color, varying values. So you have these light layers underneath, and you put the darker layers over the top, but you don't cover up all of those lighter layers so you can still see them through the darker top layers. Look at that. That got really dark there in the center. It looks a little, I'm adding in some of my darker contrast right now. It looks a little odd at this point because the background is still very white. I think here in a minute I'll probably start putting in the background so that doesn't look so strange. But right here was one of my favorite bits, is adding in these little shadows on the edge of the caramel. But I'm adding in these little crumbs, and I'm making these crumbs on the top of the donut with the same principle I used making this bigger crumb off to the side. And that's the little speckles with the lighter layers on the bottom and the darker layers on top, not completely covering up the previous lighter layers. But I meant to tell you about one of my favorite parts were these little shadows on the caramel, and I used a teeny tiny brush and a little bit of that dark chocolate color that I started out with, and just drew on the teeniest shadows in some of the loops of the caramel and on some of the edges. This is when you really have to start paying attention to those tiny details, because you've got to see where your shadow lies and where your highlight is, and work to build that representation in your piece. Now we finally got this plate starting to come in here. Donut looks so strange, just floating around in a white void, like the Matrix loading room. So now I'm going to start working on this little plate that I had put in here. It was a cool little plate. It's got a swirly pattern on it. I got it at the dollar spot at Target maybe 15 years ago. So I guess it's a good plate. It's lasted so long. Now I'm adding in some of these deeper shadows. Again, I'm not using black for these shadows. I'm just using that dark chocolate color. Maybe for the shadows I might have added a little bit more blue, muted that warm tone a little bit more, but it's just varying mixtures of this base chocolate color that I mixed right at the beginning. Yeah, see there's some wet blue on my little palette there. I definitely added some blue in there for those shadows. Those little crumbs starting to really pop up. And that's because they have those darkest spots where the shadow is, and it's maintaining the highlight of the crumb there on the top. That's looking really cool. Putting in my plate some more. This was also fun to draw too, the plate, because I got to do this teeny tiny highlight. The side of the plate is a black porcelain, and it has the light reflects off it on the side, so this was fun for me to paint too, because I got to make that tiny white highlight in that porcelain edge. I really do love the cool wavy pattern on this plate. Look at it go, wavy pattern. A cool pattern like this can go a long way to making it feel like your main subject matter is resting on top of something. It gives it more of a sense of depth, because you can have that pattern start on one side of your object and then continue smoothly on the other side. It gives it a sense of, unity underneath the main subject, so that the main subject stands on top of it instead of setting inside of it. I don't know if any of you had that problem before. It's partially to do with shading too, but there's all sorts of little tricks you can do to get your main subject to pop out into the foreground like you want it to. But I really like that pattern. It really does help it with the pop. There's that brown background. I suppose I could have done something more fun for that background, but really that's just the table. That's just the table my little plate was sitting on. Oh well. It is a nice neutral background. It worked just fine for this. Man, that donut's looking tasty. One of my least favorite things about doing this painting was how much I wanted that donut. Because at this point, I had already eaten this donut. This donut was long gone by now. I was working off of a picture that I had of the donut. Well, this picture I have right here, up in the corner. I was working off a picture for this painting, and I desperately wanted that donut again. And I couldn't even go get one because she's not in the same city as I am. I'll have to order some more next time she's in town. Those donuts are amazing. Now I'm just adding in some more rich tones into my main donut. I don't want that whole highlighted section. I didn't want it to stay as one solid piece. I wanted there to be some breaks in that highlight. I'm adding in the shadow. I was not 100% pleased with the shadow, to be completely honest, but maybe that was just because I liked the donut so much. I did like the donut so much. Yeah, it's just a little, I did it in too much of a chunk, I think, and just didn't look quite right to me, but that's nitpicking, nitpicking. There's the darkest part. My very favorite part of a shadow when you're doing a 3D object like this is the very darkest part where the shadow kisses the actual object. I love that little mark. Broke it up a little bit. I wanted to make sure it was still lighter in the lighter parts of the pattern. I didn't want to lose the pattern. And this is where I stopped particularly liking the shadow, but it's not so bad. It could have been worse. Oh yeah, the shadow in the plate. I actually did quite like the shadow of the plate. And having a composition like this in your piece where you have the background and your object and something that the object is resting on, it really gives you the opportunity to add depth to the whole thing because you can add multiple layers of shadows. Little shadow over there. Must have had a hard light. I probably had a lamp on this when I took the picture. If you're taking your own pictures that you would like to paint from then later on, up there, don't forget to add the shadow on the crumb. If you're taking your own photos that you want to paint from later on, try and get the most dramatic light you can have while still looking good for whatever you're photographing. Really strong lighting gives you a lot of the highlights and the contrast that you're going to need to represent already to make it look good. You don't have to just make it up. I've had to paint things from crummy photos before, and it does make it a lot more difficult to get those details down. And see, I just keep going in there with more and more little dark bits. You just add it little bits at a time. Don't get impatient with your piece. Don't add too many things at once. Put a few things in there, let it dry, step back from it every once in a while and give it a good look. See if it's going in the direction you like. And then once your layer's dry, come in and add a few more little bits of dark. There's no real rush. There's no real rush to get this done. Just take your time and build slowly. This is like a 3D puzzle that you're constructing here. You see how I kept that highlight there on the very edge of the frosting as it drips over the side of the donut? That's one of my favorite little bits in this piece. Besides the caramel shadow I mentioned to you earlier, it's that little highlight on the very edge of that icing. Isn't that gorgeous? There's my tiniest watercolor brush in there, putting those little shadows in. That caramel is blocking the light from my lamp. It has to be represented by that teeny shadow. Watercolor is great for making teeny shadows because you can put a line of a dark color on there, and then you can use a clean, damp brush and just soften the hard edge of that line out into your main subject. And it can create some gorgeous, gorgeous soft shadows, just like this right here. One of the things that I struggled with as I started drawing and painting more, especially painting, for some reason I had a harder time with this when I was painting. It was not being afraid of contrast, especially if you're doing something like a face. It's always really intimidating to throw those super, super darks in there, even if you can see them with your eye, even if you're looking at it in the picture and it's a dark, dark shadow. It's hard to put that in your picture, especially if you spent so much time on it already. It's hard to put it in there, but you got to take the plunge because those lights aren't going to shine without those darks contrasting them. Just adding some more shadows to those little crumbs on top. Aren't they looking delicious? Do you not want a donut right now? Alright, so now I'm adding in some darker crumbs to the bottom and sides of my cake part where there's a bite taken out of my donut. There is going to be less light hitting the bottom half of that bite segment, so I made sure to get some darker tones on that bottom side closest to the plate. Now see, I'm trying to desperately soften up my shadow here, but it was dry a little too long. It softened up a little bit though, it's okay. It's easiest to soften a shadow if you do it right away while it's still mostly wet. If you let it dry, it's not as easy. I'm just adding some more dark tones around the outside edges of my shape to give that three-dimensional pop to it. I'm adding a very light glaze. See this reddish? I added a little bit more red to my chocolate brown. And I'm giving it just a warm glaze over the top of this chocolate frosting. A little bit of shadows on my caramel, because that caramel is in a solid color. It's got reflections and shadows and curves and shapes too, just like the rest of this donut. That caramel, I had a hard time keeping those sharp highlights in the caramel ribbon. I think if I were to do this again, I would probably use masking fluid for some of these teeny tiny highlights. Masking fluid sometimes leaves quite a harsh line though, so I'm almost glad that I didn't do it. Oh well. Looks like we're getting close to the end here. I gotta add some finishing touches, darkening up that central donut hole area. I find the easiest way to make a nice shadow on a curve like that is to start dark where it curves away from the light the most and then just slowly draw it out toward the center. So that's what I'm doing here, just dotting in some more colors, looking for places I can improve. Making sure I got enough contrast in all my little spots. I love those little crumbs. Look at those. It just adds a little something special. I'm drawing out my shadow a little bit because there's a teeny cast shadow on each of those crumbs. So I drew that shadow out just a little bit more. Now I faded that highlight. See, there's still a highlight on the edge of my frosting here, but I faded it out on that side that's covered up mostly by caramel because it wasn't such a strong highlight as the little white one on the edge of the frosting over here on the right. So it got shaded out a little bit. And that's another thing that adds realism, because not all of your highlights are going to be pure white. You know, you're going to have some pale highlights of the color of your object. Just adding these tiny, tiny details, making that caramel look good. A little bit darker here, a little bit darker there. This is a piece that's really fun to just play with. Something like this where the light is reflected. And the more I add those little dark colors to my caramel ribbon, the more those little highlights stand out and shine. There, I added a couple little spots of, I think it was white ink. I was seeing if I could pop up those highlights on the crumb a little bit more, but I didn't like how it worked out, so I didn't keep going with it. Doesn't that frosting look tasty? Gotta get a donut now, I guess. There's not a lot to say about this next section. I'm just adding in some more dark shadows here and there as I see them, so I'm just gonna let you watch by yourself and put in a little bit of music. There I am trying to add a few more little highlights. That's where I would have used maybe masking fluid beforehand instead of, but this worked out alright. I'm adding a little bit of, I can't tell if this is ink or just a little bit of diluted acrylic. Let me see how it dries. Looks like it could be a little bit of diluted acrylic for just a couple of those highlights. Now I'm making sure my crumbs, I'm adding in some more speckles because there's not just going to be the giant crumbs that you notice first off. There's little speckles all around it too. A few more shadows around the edges. Man, look at that caramel pop. Here I am right at the end, just making sure all of these highlights pop. Getting in my last bit of detail work. It's looking pretty good though. Alright, it looks like I'm finally finishing up. I'm the sort of person that can just never stop finicking with little details, so I finicked with this donut quite a while here. Just adding little shadows here and there in the curves of the caramel and underneath all the crumbs. Making sure it looked just right, but this looks like a pretty done donut to me, you guys. That looks pretty great. Thank you guys for coming. I suppose you may not all be guys. I apologize. Thank you all for coming and looking at my cool donut video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it because it was a great fun video, and man, I could just take a bite out of that picture. Well, anyway, I'll see you guys the next time. Did it again. I'll see you all next time. And like my video and subscribe if you liked it. I suppose if you liked it. Anyway, I'll see you next time. I'm just rambling now, you guys. Goodbye. Goodbye.